In 2025, the United States exported more crude oil and petroleum products than it imported. The net surplus was 2.8 million barrels every day, shipped to roughly 125 countries. The Netherlands alone received 825,000 barrels a day of American crude, more than any other nation on Earth. This was not the first time America's position in the global oil market reversed course. In October 1973, it reversed the other way. That month, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries acting through a body called OPEC, imposed an embargo on the United States. They cut production and refused to sell oil to America. Within 5 months, the price of a barrel of crude had gone from $2.90 to $11.65. American drivers paying 38 cents a gallon for gasoline at the start of 1973 were paying 55 cents by 1974. The United States economy shrank by approximately 2.5%. Unemployment rose, inflation rose, gas lines stretched around city blocks, rationed by license plate, odd numbers one day, even numbers the next. The trigger was a war. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated attack on Israel. The United States responded by airlifting weapons to Israel under Operation Nickel Grass. On October 19th, President Nixon formally requested $2.2 billion in emergency military aid to Israel. The following day, Saudi Arabia and the other Arab oil-producing states announced a total embargo on American oil imports. Ahmed Zaki Yamani, Saudi Arabia's oil minister and the public face of the OPEC strategy, declared at the time, "The moment has come. We are finally masters of our own commodity." They were. What made that declaration so consequential was how exposed America had left itself. By 1973, the United States was importing 34.8% of its oil from foreign countries. Domestic production was already in decline. United States output had fallen to just 16% of global production. The country had virtually no spare capacity, no cushion, nothing to absorb a shock. The Arab production cuts represented only about 7% of the petroleum available to the United States. A 7% physical shortage, the panic, the gas lines, the price quadrupling, none of that was purely a physical phenomenon. It was also psychological. Markets seized, behavior changed. A modest supply disruption was amplified into a national crisis because the United States had no credible answer to it. The policy response that followed was sweeping and lasted, in some ways, for half a century. Nixon signed the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act in November 1973, imposing mandatory price and allocation controls. In December 1975, President Gerald Ford signed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which included a near-total ban on the export of American crude oil. That ban would remain in place for 40 years. By the mid-2000s, a technique called hydraulic fracturing combined with horizontal drilling, commonly known as fracking, was being applied at scale in the Barnett Shale in north-central Texas. Within a decade, that technology had reached the Permian Basin in West Texas and New Mexico, a formation extending across 55 counties and more than 86,000 square miles, home to over 7,000 individual oil fields. By 2009, United States crude production stood at 5.4 million barrels per day. By 2015, it had reached 9.4 million. By 2018, the United States had become the largest crude oil producer in the world. By 2024, production had hit a record 13.3 million barrels per day, a 165% increase since 2008. Today, roughly 45% of all American oil comes from the Permian Basin alone. The export ban, the direct legislative product of the 1973 embargo, was repealed on December 18, 2015, when President Obama signed it away as part of a broader appropriations bill. The numbers moved almost immediately. Crude oil exports went from less than 500,000 barrels per day in 2015 to nearly 3 million barrels per day by 2019. In September of that year, the United States exported more crude oil and petroleum products than it imported for the first time since monthly records began. Records that started in 1973, the year of the embargo. On an annual basis, the crossover came in 2020. From 2015 to 2024, the United States accounted for 90% of the increase in global oil supply worldwide. The chain is traceable. The embargo triggered the export ban. The ban kept domestic prices artificially suppressed for decades. Suppressed prices paradoxically incentivized domestic drilling as producers chased volume. The drilling drove a technology shift. The technology made the ban irrelevant. Lifting the ban unleashed a global supply surge. What OPEC did in 1973 to break American energy confidence set in motion the sequence that, 50 years later, turned the United States into the world's largest oil exporter. That arc is real. But the comparison has limits, and they matter. When Yamani said the Arab states were masters of their commodity, he meant it literally. Saudi Arabia owned its oil fields. OPEC's member governments could open or close a valve with a single decision. The export surge coming out of the United States today is not a government strategy. It is the aggregate output of thousands of private operators, independent drillers, publicly traded companies, private equity-backed producers, all responding to price signals. ExxonMobil exported roughly $10.5 billion worth of petroleum products in 2024. Chevron, $9.2 billion. ConocoPhillips, $8.7 billion. These are corporations, not instruments of state. Washington cannot direct their production the way Riyadh could in 1973. The United States does not have that lever. There is a second structural distinction. The United States is simultaneously a large exporter and a large importer of crude oil. In 2025, crude oil still comprised 78% of American imports. Gulf Coast refineries were built to process heavy, high-sulfur crude, the kind that comes from the Middle East and Venezuela. Much of what comes out of the Permian Basin is light, sweet crude. Those refineries are not optimized for, so it gets exported. America exports what its refineries cannot efficiently process and imports what they need. The net exporter label is accurate, but it describes an economy embedded in global oil trade from both directions. The geopolitical weight is also different in kind. The 1973 embargo was a deliberate act of economic warfare. Sovereign governments used a commodity as a weapon against a specific adversary. The American export surge is a market outcome. Private capital chased technology, technology unlocked reserves, reserves became exports. That is not an oil weapon, even if it carries geopolitical consequences. With those distinctions on the table, here is where things stand in mid-2026. The Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows, has been effectively closed for more than 3 months. The Brent crude spot price averaged $107 per barrel in May 2026. Against that backdrop, the structural reality of American export capacity carries weight it did not a decade ago. Whether the United States can fully replace what the Hormuz closure has removed from global supply is a more complicated question, one that no individual company or government agency can answer by turning a dial. But the United States enters this disruption as the largest crude producer in the world and a net exporter of nearly 3 million barrels per day. That is not the country that stood in gas lines in 1973. What the embargo ultimately demonstrated was that energy vulnerability is a political choice, or more precisely, a set of accumulated political and economic choices that leave a nation exposed when markets move. The United States made those choices through most of the 20th century, paid for them in 1973, and spent the next 50 years, often without intending to, building a different set of answers. Whether those answers hold under the current pressure in the Strait of Hormuz is the unresolved question. The historical record does not promise anything. It only shows what happened the last time America found out how dependent it had become.